The village of Kijiji lay cradled between thick forests and red-earthed hills, a place where the wind whispered secrets it wasn't allowed to speak aloud. In Kijiji, tradition was not just a practice, it was a wall, a rule, a root that wound itself around every limb of a girl until she was bent low, like the old fig trees in the chief's courtyard. Women in Kijiji were flowers pressed between pages, meant to be admired quietly but never to unfold on their own. From the moment a girl could walk, her steps were measured, counted, and trimmed. From the moment she could talk, her voice was softened, then folded into songs that never reached the open sky. Among these daughters was Abony. Abony was born with eyes too wide and questions too sharp. The midwife who first held her swore the infant stared directly at the sun and didn't blink. As she grew, so did her defiance of the invisible boundaries drawn by age, by gender, by fear. Where other girls played near the wells, singing braiding songs, Abony followed butterflies to the edge of the fields. Where others bowed their heads when elders passed, Abony tilted hers and asked, "Why do we do this?" Her laughter was louder than the drums, her silence heavier than rain. She danced with the shadows of birds on the ground, pretending she had wings. Her parents, Adissa and Temi, were respected in the village, steady, quiet people who had buried their own dreams beneath layers of duty and were content to grow old in the same house where they had been born. They loved their daughter, but their love was laced with fear. Fear of the way she climbed trees just to touch the sky. Fear of the way she stood still in storms, letting the rain soak through her instead of running for cover. Fear that her spirit would carry her beyond the borders of Kijiji, and fear of what the world would do to her if she left the walls meant to contain her. They scolded her. They pleaded. Her mother wept in prayers, whispering to ancestors for guidance. Her father began walking home earlier from the fields, just to keep an eye on her. But the wind in Abony was stubborn. It pushed and pulled. One evening, when the air smelled of mango blossoms and distant fires, Abony stood by the old fig tree and told the breeze, "I will follow you one day. I don't care if the world eats me." That same evening, an elder named Mama Nia, who sat on a mat weaving silence into stories, called Abony close. The woman's voice was dry and cracked like bark, but it carried the weight of storms. "Come here, windchild," she said. Abony obeyed, curious. "Girls who chase the wind," Mama Nia said, her fingers never stopping their work, "never return whole. They think freedom is out there, but freedom has teeth. Freedom bites. Some come back missing pieces. Some never come back. And some become the wind, and then the village forgets their names." Abony felt the words plant something cold inside her chest. But it didn't take root. Instead, her heart pounded harder as if it were trying to fly. She tried to be still after that. 4 days she braided mats with the other girls, fetched water, ground millet with her mother. But the wind outside her hut kept calling. It tapped at her window like a friend who refused to be ignored. The hills that curved in the distance like sleeping giants pulled at her, tempting her with their mystery. Abony could not sleep. Each night, she stared at the moon until her bones itched with longing. And so one morning, before the sun had fully yawned into the sky, Abony wrapped her ankles in cloth, tied a bag of dried mango to her waist, and slipped out of her hut. Her footsteps were soft, but her excitement was loud. She moved through the narrow paths with the ease of someone walking into a dream. The village shrank behind her. She smiled when she reached the first hill and saw the world stretch farther than she'd ever imagined. Her arms opened wide and she spun in the wind's embrace. But her joy was short-lived. Her uncle Bako, a man whose face always seemed carved from stone, had seen her leave. He had followed her in silence, his feet practiced in the art of hunting, his rage simmering. He grabbed her roughly by the arm just as she reached the crest of the second hill. Abony gasped, stumbled, but didn't cry out. He dragged her back through the trees, ignoring her protests, her screams, her tears. "You want to run?" he hissed. "Then you will never run again." When they reached the village, he called a meeting. Elders gathered. Her parents stood by, eyes filled with shame and fear. No one defended her. Not even her mother. Abony's heart pounded not with fear but with betrayal. The punishment was declared in the name of tradition. "She has no respect for the laws," one elder said. "If she will not stay within the walls, then we must make it so." "She must be protected from herself," another added, nodding. The decision was swift, as cruel things often are. Abony was held down by hands that had once stroked her hair, kissed her forehead. Her uncle took a sharp knife. There was no ceremony, no chanting. Just silence. And then a scream that broke the sky. They cut her feet, not fully but deeply enough to ruin the tendons, to twist her steps forever. "Now she will stay home," someone whispered. Now she will be safe. But Ebony knew what they had done. They hadn't protected her. They had caged her. Her body was broken not by a beast, not by a storm, but by those who were supposed to keep her whole. They carried her back to her hut and left her there. The walls closed in. The air grew stale. Days passed. Her feet throbbed and numbed. Her mother brought food but could not meet her eyes. Her father sat silently once but said nothing. Even the wind seemed afraid to speak. But Ebony did not die. Her feet were wounded, yes, but her spirit was not. She sat by her window each day whispering stories to the wind. She carved her dreams into the wood of the walls. She imagined herself flying still. When the wind passed by, it lingered a little longer, curling through the cracks in the walls as if listening. Ebony could not run anymore. But her dreams still did. And in the quiet, in the confinement, she began to change. She began to listen, to the wind, to the silence, to the thump of her heart. It no longer tried to fly. It began to hum. Not loudly, but steadily. A rhythm. A song. A waiting. She was not gone. She was not defeated. She was becoming something else. The days after the punishment folded in on themselves, slow and aching. Ebony lay on the mat in her hut, her feet wrapped in rough cloth soaked with herbs that stung more than they soothed. The pain pulsed like a second heartbeat, a cruel reminder of how far she had reached and how quickly the world had pulled her back. She rarely spoke. Her mouth was bitter with silence and her eyes had lost their fire, or so the villagers thought. But the wind knew better. It had not abandoned her. It slipped through the narrow cracks in her hut's wooden walls with the sly persistence of an old friend. Where others tiptoed around her pain or ignored her altogether, the wind came boldly. It arrived in the quiet hours before dawn, carrying with it the perfume of distant places, smoke from unknown fires, the salt of hidden oceans, the sweetness of foreign blossoms. It touched her face like a mother's hand, like the ghost of freedom. The villagers believed her spirit had been broken. That with the loss of her feet, her will had been clipped like the wings of a bird too restless. But even in her stillness, Ebony listened. She heard the wind's song woven between the groans of the old wood, in the way it made the grass outside her hut dance even when no one else was watching. Some mornings the wind brought her gifts. Tiny seeds landed on her floor, seeds she had never seen in Kijiji's fields. One was shaped like a teardrop and shimmered green when the light hit it. Another was feather-light, pale blue and curved like a smile. She collected them in a cracked clay bowl, her fingers trembling with the effort, her eyes wide with wonder. Once she found a feather near her mat, long and silver as if plucked from a moonlit bird. No one had come in. The wind had brought it, she was sure. Another time, a thread of music drifted in, a tune her mother had once hummed when grinding maize, a lullaby from her infancy. But no one was singing it nearby. It came from beyond the village or from before memory. It came with the wind, soft and stubborn, as if determined to remind her that she belonged to more than Kijiji's walls. Loneliness wrapped around her like another bandage, but the wind unwrapped her one layer at a time. It made the silence bearable. It made the pain not disappear but shimmer with meaning. Sometimes, when the ache in her feet became too loud to ignore, she would whisper into the air, her voice small and broken, "Why did they do this to me?" And though the wind never answered in words, it pressed against her cheeks, it rustled the leaves outside, it made the flame in her oil lamp flicker, not in fear but in rhythm. As if saying, "You're still alive. You're still becoming." Ebony began to speak to it more often, not as a prayer but as a conversation. She told it her dreams, her regrets, her fury. She told it of the hills she had only tasted, of the way her uncle's hand had bruised her arm, of the betrayal in her mother's silence. The wind never judged her. It carried her secrets away, or tucked them into corners of the room where only it could find them again. One night, unable to sleep, she sat up and pressed her fingers into the dust on the floor. With slow, shaking hands she drew shapes, at first just circles, lines and spirals. But then something inside her pulsed. She began to draw wings. Broad ones. Curved ones. Some with sharp feathers, others soft like clouds. Some with eyes hidden in their spans. She drew birds she had never seen, creatures made of freedom and fire. She didn't know where the images came from, but they filled her with a strange peace. Her fingers kept moving even when her arms ached. She began to draw them every day, letting the wind erase the dust at night, only to sketch again in the morning. Her grandmother, Nana Iyer, was the only one who dared to speak freely to Ebony after what had happened. Nana Iyer was old, half-blind, and carried a walking stick carved with runes no one else could read. She had been feared once, long ago, whispered about for her visions and her stubborn refusal to be tamed. Now she was mostly ignored, except when a child was sick or an omen needed interpreting. She came one afternoon, leaning heavily on her stick, her white hair loose around her face. "You've been talking to the wind," she said without preamble. Ebony blinked. "How do you know?" "I've talked to it too." Nana Iyer smiled. "Long before you were born." Ebony said nothing, but her heart thumped. The old woman lowered herself beside the mat, bones cracking like old wood. She reached into her cloak and pulled out a carved pendant, a small bird, wings outstretched, eyes wide. "They used to say," Nana Iyer began, "that some girls are born with bird hearts. Not meant for the ground. Not made for walls. The earth tries to hold them, but their spirits belong to the sky." Ebony's eyes filled. She looked down at her wrapped feet. "Then why did they take my wings?" she whispered. "They didn't," Nana Iyer said. "They only tried to. But wings aren't always on your body, child. Sometimes they're inside you, quiet. Waiting." Ebony clutched the pendant. "Are there stories? Of girls like me?" Nana Iyer leaned back and began her tale. "There was once a girl," she said, "who refused to stay in the hut. She followed the wind one day and disappeared. The elders said she had been swallowed by the forest. But her mother said that, on the third night, she heard the flutter of wings and saw a bird with eyes like her daughter's. It circled her roof and sang her name. Every year after that, birds would visit her home on the same night, bringing feathers and seeds." Ebony listened, her breath held in her throat. "There were many stories," Nana Iyer continued. "Girls who leapt into the river and rose as cranes. Girls whose shadows flew away from their bodies and perched on trees. They called them witches, dreamers, cursed. But I think they were just wind daughters. Like you." The next morning, Ebony sat outside her hut for the first time in weeks, her legs trembling, her body leaning against the frame for balance. She closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face. The wind came, playful and sweet, tugging at her braids. She hummed, just a little tune, something that came to her in the moment, without words. She didn't notice the first person watching her. Or the second. But by the time the market women passed by, arms full of cassava and gossip, they saw her. "Look," one whispered. "The wind-mad girl is singing to nothing." "Does she think she's a bird now?" another chuckled. "She'll fly away on broken feet," someone else said, laughing. Ebony heard them. She turned her head slightly but said nothing. Her smile was soft, almost sad. "Let them laugh." She hummed louder. Children began to mock her tune, flapping their arms, mimicking bird calls. But Ebony kept humming. Not for them. Not for spite. For herself. Because even laughter, sharp as thorns, could not cut through the song the wind had taught her. The mocking grew. A woman spat near her doorway. "Madness runs in the blood," she muttered. Her grandmother was the same. Some men shook their heads. "She's useless now. A girl who cannot walk is only a mouth to feed." But Ebony no longer listened to them. Their voices sounded like rustling leaves, fading with each breeze. Her ears were tuned to the wind alone. Each day she sat outside, she sang a little more. She painted wings in the dust again, and now she added tails, talons, beaks. Birds with names only the wind knew. She whispered the stories her grandmother told, rewriting them in her mind, shaping them into a map. At night, when the village slept, the wind returned, faster now, bolder. It knocked gently at her door, curled around her arms, whispered to her wounds. It brought more feathers. Some short and soft. Others long and sharp like blades. It scattered seeds on her roof. A vine began to grow near her hut, though no one had planted it. One morning she awoke to find a bird perched on her window. It did not fly when she moved. It stared at her, tilting its head. Its feathers shimmered with colors she had never seen before, violet, emerald, ash. She extended her finger, and it stepped on it without fear. "Are you one of them?" she asked. The bird blinked. "Are you what I'm meant to be?" The bird flapped once and flew. Ebony watched it disappear into the rising sun, her heart swollen, not with sadness but with recognition. The villagers would keep laughing. But the wind would not stop coming. And neither would she. Ebony's window had once been just a hole in the wall, an uneven square that let in morning light and sometimes the rain. But now it had become something else. A portal. A passage. A promise. The birds found it before she fully understood what was happening. It started with one, a small brown sparrow with a single white streak down its back. It landed on the wooden edge, tilted its head at her, and dropped a tiny feather before fluttering away. She thought nothing of it at first. But the next day another bird came. A dove this time, pale as moonlight, carrying a glossy black bead in its beak. It didn't land, just circled her hut twice before releasing the bead mid-air. It struck the ground softly and rolled to her bandaged feet. More followed. A green parrot arrived with a curved twig in its talons, shaped like a crescent moon. A blue-tailed starling brought a bright orange seed. One bird even delivered a strip of shiny cloth, no larger than a finger, threaded with gold. Ebony began to collect these gifts: feathers of all colors, smooth stones that shone in strange light, twisted bits of bark, glassy wings from long-dead insects, and trinkets the birds must have stolen from somewhere beyond Kijiji. She didn't ask why they came. She only knew they brought her comfort. That their presence was not chance but invitation. She cleared a corner by her window, smoothing the dirt with her palm. There she built an altar, not like the ones the village used to honor ancestors, but something entirely her own. She arranged the feathers in a spiral, placed the bead at the center, lined the twigs and seeds along the edge. Every morning she sat before it, hands folded, whispering thanks into the space beyond the window. The birds didn't always bring something. Sometimes they only came to perch, to watch her with curious eyes. Sometimes they chirped low sounds that felt more like language than song. And always, behind them, came the wind. It arrived as if following the birds or perhaps leading them, a dance of wing and breath that filled her hut with murmurs and motion. At night the whispers grew louder. The birds would flutter just beyond the window's edge, silhouetted against the moonlight, while the wind circled the hut like a guardian spirit. They made no human sense, but Ebony heard their meaning in her bones. Their rustling, their cries, the wind sighing, it was all part of a conversation she was slowly learning to join. Sometimes she dreamt of a great sky, of wings unfurling, of diving through clouds, of riding currents so powerful they sang like drums. In these dreams she was weightless, her wounds gone, her body light and long. And always when she woke there were feathers near her hands, caught between her fingers or lying across her chest. Once she woke to find a thin line of downy fluff pressed to her cheek. And then came the morning her scars glowed. She noticed it first in the low light, when the fire's embers were still faint and her breath hung in the air. Her feet had long since scabbed over, but that morning as she pulled the cloth away to clean them, she gasped. The skin around the old wounds shimmered faintly, like the surface of a river catching first light. Not bright, but unmistakably aglow. Pale blue. Pulsing slightly as if alive. She ran her fingers over them. No pain. Just warmth. A gentle hum. She did not scream. She did not cry. Instead she smiled. The wind rushed through the cracks at that very moment, shaking the walls, lifting the feathers on her altar. Outside, the birds let out a sharp, unified cry. Not a warning. A welcome. The transformation had begun. Ebony no longer feared it. She no longer mourned what had been taken. Her body was becoming something new, something the village could not understand, and that made them restless. They began to notice the birds. At first, the elders shrugged it off as coincidence. But then they began to whisper. That there were too many birds near Ebony's hut. That strange things were happening. Feathers appearing in unusual places, animals acting nervous, the wind around her home growing unpredictable. Some said the birds watched them, not just her. That they gathered in the trees even when she wasn't outside, waiting. Rumors spread quickly in Kijiji like fire through dry grass. She speaks with creatures, one said. She's been touched by something dark, another murmured. She calls storms with her breath. She's cursed. Her parents were the first to be approached. The village elders came one morning, solemn and silent, their shadows long across the yard. She is disturbing the balance, said Elder Munaki. Wind belongs outside. She invites it in. She is unclean, another muttered. Scarred by disobedience and made proud by pain. She must be silenced before others follow her path, the oldest elder declared. Before girls think they can fly. Ebony heard the voices from inside. She sat quietly on her mat, listening, not just to their threats but to the low rumble growing behind their words. The wind was stirring. It gathered in the distance, whirling over fields and trees, tugging at thatched roofs, bending branches. The air thickened with tension. Her parents returned inside, faces pale, their mouths stiff. You must stop, her mother said. Stop feeding the birds. Stop humming. Stop sitting at the window. Her father stood at the door, not speaking. Just watching her as though she were already gone. I can't, Ebony said softly. You must. I won't. Her mother raised a hand, not to strike but to cover her mouth as if afraid of what would spill out if she spoke. That night they tried to close the window. They nailed rough wood across the opening, sealing it shut. They scattered ashes on the altar. Her father pushed her mat to the other side of the hut and tied the curtain shut with rope. The birds did not come that night. But the wind did. It howled, not in rage but in grief. It shook the hut, pulling at the roof, slipping beneath the door, making the ashes swirl into patterns that looked like wings. Ebony sat in the dark, tears falling silently. Her hands trembled, not in fear but in fury. They could try to silence her. They could try to seal the window. But they could not silence the wind. And they could not stop what was awakening inside her. When she slept, her dreams returned fiercer than before. This time, she flew above the village, looking down at the people who had caged her. She saw their fear, their chains, their walls. She saw herself rising above them, wings stretched wide, her scars glowing with power. She soared until Kijiji was no more than a whisper below her. And when she woke, breathless and aching, the boards over the window were gone. Ripped clean away. The rope that held the curtain had been snapped. Her altar was whole again, the beads and feathers rearranged into a new shape, an arrow pointing toward the door. She smiled. The wind was not asking permission anymore. It was clearing the way. The night began with silence, so thick it clung to skin, settled in the lungs like dust. Even the goats quieted, and the leaves of the great baobab stood still as if holding breath. In Kijiji, such silence was always a warning. It meant the wind was listening, pulling back before it pounced. Then came the first howl. It rose from the eastern hills, low and trembling like a drum echoing in the belly of the earth. Windows began to tremble. Doors, some bolted, some cracked with age, moaned under pressure. Roofs creaked and the trees began to argue with the sky. The villagers rushed about with mats, ropes, and hurried prayers, fastening whatever could be tied and whispering to ancestors between clenched teeth. But Ebony's hut stood strangely still. From outside it looked like any other. Its thatched roof sagged slightly from years of rain, and its mud walls bore the stains of many seasons. But inside the wind danced freely. It moved not like destruction but like an old friend returning with stories. It spiraled around Ebony's sleeping mat, lifted her braids gently from her shoulders, and hummed in the spaces between her ribs. She sat upright as a crack of thunder split the village sky. Not in fear but in recognition. Her little altar by the window, a humble nest of feathers, beads, twigs, and whispers, glowed faintly in the storm's breath. Every item seemed alive, shifting subtly like they too were waiting for something. The wind didn't howl here. It whispered. It curled around her scarred feet and moved like silk over her arms. Ebony closed her eyes and let her fingers rise into the air, as if catching invisible threads. Outside chaos. The storm tore through the village like a song of fury. It kicked up years of dust and unspoken truths. Banana leaves ripped. Grain pots cracked. Doors banged open without permission and slammed shut with defiance. Mothers clutched their children. Elders knelt and chanted to gods they hadn't spoken to in decades. And all the while someone kept saying her name. Ebony. It passed from house to house like a warning or a prayer, no one sure which. By the time the wind screamed loudest, some claimed they saw birds circling above her hut, forming spirals in the air as if shielding it. Some said the air above her roof shimmered like heat. One child swore the rain never touched her home at all. Her father had been drinking Mariela wine when the first gust tore his own door from its hinges. His firewood scattered and his pride scattered further. When he heard her name whispered in fear and awe, something inside him cracked. Not with understanding but with anger. He staggered through the storm, soaked in cursing, and kicked open her door. The wind stilled. Just for a second. Everything quieted as if the storm itself paused to see what he would do. Her father pointed at the altar. This is what you've brought upon us. Ebony met his eyes and did not flinch. He grabbed a gourd of oil and poured it over the feathers and twigs. He struck a match and dropped it. But nothing burned. The fire hissed, sputtered, and died. The feathers remained unscorched. Even the oil vanished as if swallowed by air. He stepped back, mouth trembling, then turned and ran out into the rain. Behind him, Ebony didn't move. The wind curled around her once more like a shawl. Above her, a great bird cried out. Then another. Soon a chorus of wings and throats filled the sky. They didn't flee the storm. They danced with it. Villagers emerged from their homes, looking up in awe as a swirl of white and black birds spun over the village center. Their cries weren't frantic. They were calling. Mourning. Celebrating. No one could tell. Inside her hut, Ebony stood. She had not stood in months, not since her feet had been taken from her by the blades of tradition and the fear of freedom. But now they no longer screamed with pain. no longer buckled. She rose slowly, trembling not from weakness but from wonder. Her feet touched the ground and did not flinch. Her scars pulsed with warmth, as if the wind had been mending them all along. She took a step. Then another. When her mother came running in after her husband, soaked and shaking, she found Ebony upright, eyes full of something ancient and vast. She gasped, then dropped to her knees, not in worship but in remembrance. Tears slid down her mother's face. Not just from fear or awe but from the ache of memories long buried. "I used to dance," she whispered. Ebony looked down at her. "I used to stand under the moon and twirl until the stars looked like fireflies. I used to dream of flying, Ebony. I used to dream." Ebony moved to her, cradled her head, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm outside lessened as if the wind, too, needed to listen. All through the night the storm raged. But in the hearts of many, something quieter stirred. Not fear. Not defiance. Something nameless. Something like a question. Old men who had once cut their daughters' feet sat awake in their corners, listening to the wind's cries and wondering what they had truly protected. Women who had long silenced their thoughts remembered lullabies about rivers and skies. Children, restless and wide-eyed, whispered tales to each other about feathers that couldn't burn and girls who didn't bow. By morning roofs lay scattered. Trees bent and fences lay flat like tired elders. But Ebony's hut stood untouched. Around it the grass had not even bent. Birds nested in its eaves, and the wind still moved within its walls, soft now, like breath. The villagers gathered near her door, not knocking, not speaking. Just watching. Ebony stepped out slowly barefoot. She walked past them, down the path to the river, the wind lifting the hem of her dress, her feet barely sinking into the mud. She moved like someone remembering how to be whole. No one stopped her. They only stared, uncertain whether they had witnessed a curse or a miracle. Behind her, her mother stood in the doorway, shoulders back, eyes sharp. When a woman asked, trembling, "Is she something else now?" her mother replied, "No. She is what they tried to keep her from becoming." That day the village didn't go back to normal. Fences were left unfixed. Songs were hummed to unfamiliar rhythms. Children began tying feathers into their hair, and the old women let them. Fathers looked at their daughters a little longer, not with control but with unease. What if they too heard the wind? And in the hearts of those who had watched Ebony rise, something shifted. Not fully. Not enough to change centuries in a single breath. But something small. A sliver in the wall. A crack in the root. A doorway that wouldn't stay shut anymore. And above, birds circled in the sky, whispering to the clouds that a girl had walked again. Not in spite of the wind, but because of it. At first, Ebony walked only in the mornings, when the mist still held the night's breath and the sun's fingers had not yet claimed the hills. Her steps were unsure but soft, as if the earth beneath her knew her weight again and greeted her like a long-lost kin. The wind followed her. Always. It curled around her ankles, tugged gently at her shawl, and sometimes lifted leaves before her as though clearing a path. Children were the first to notice. They saw her walking along the river's edge, whispering to the breeze, her fingers outstretched like antennae tasting air. They followed, barefoot and curious, their eyes wide with wonder and unspoken questions. Ebony did not hush them. Instead she began to speak, softly at first, about things they had never heard named. "This," she said, crouching beside a bent stalk of grass, "is where the wind slept last night." She showed them how the birds tilted their wings not randomly, but by reading unseen currents in the sky. She pointed out the patterns in the dust that told stories of last night's gusts. She sketched swirling diagrams in the dirt, loops, arches, spirals, calling them wind paths. And when she looked to the clouds she whispered words like sky maps and air threads, as though the very heavens had veins and trails waiting to be followed. The children listened as if the wind itself was speaking through her mouth. They came each morning. With each sunrise more arrived, boys with reed toys still in hand, girls with half-braided hair, even babies slung across their mothers' backs who squirmed to see her. A circle would form around Ebony under the baobab or near the rocky stream, and she would speak of motion, of silence that listens, of breath that travels beyond the body. Some tried to mimic her movements, twisting hands like kites, leaping and landing silently. She smiled and nodded. The wind, she said, only answered those who respected its play. But not all eyes watched with wonder. The elders gathered in the council hut, lips pursed, voices low but heavy with warning. The girl was walking again. And talking. Filling the heads of children with nonsense. Calling dust stories, and birds guides. They remembered the storm, the altar that refused to burn, the way she had walked through the village with dry feet during a night of flood. This was no child anymore. This was a danger they hadn't named yet. She speaks of spirits not ours, one said. She has returned with power, said another. She makes children believe they can fly, murmured the oldest. Next they will try. Still they waited. Wash, whispered. Until the day the fever came. It crept into the village like smoke, slow, quiet, choking breath before anyone noticed. A boy, Kofi, barely 7, who had once brought Ebony a blue feather tied with string, fell ill. His skin burned like the sun, and his breath grew shallow, his chest rising like a bird with broken wings. His mother screamed. His father begged. The elders gathered with herbs and chants, but Kofi's eyes had already begun to glaze. Word spread. Children stopped laughing. Parents kept them indoors. And then Ebony came. She walked straight to the boy's mat, past the muttering elders and the kneeling healer. No one dared stop her. Her feet made no sound. She knelt by the child, her hands not touching but hovering above his chest. She began to sing. Not a lullaby, not a chant, but something in between, notes that rose and curled like smoke through branches, a language of air. It was not loud, but it was endless, the kind of song that wrapped around bones and loosened locked lungs. Kofi stirred. Ebony's eyes never left his. The wind pushed open the hut's flap. It circled once like a gentle tide. Kofi coughed, then gasped, then began to cry. His mother wailed with joy, clutching him to her chest. His father stared at Ebony like one might stare at a ghost. That night no one slept. By morning the name began to spread, Windwalker. First as a whisper, then a warning, then a wonder. They didn't say it aloud near her, but behind every reed fence and cooking fire, the word floated like a feather. Windwalker, girl of storms, daughter of air. Some said she healed with breath. Some said the wind obeyed her. Others claimed she was no longer girl but spirit, returned in flesh. The children still came. And more than before. They brought feathers now, laid them gently at her feet. They carved little wind symbols into stones and gave them as gifts. They begged to hear more, about sky maps, about how to read the movements of leaves, how to hear wind when it says stay or go. Ebony taught, patiently, her voice always calm, always certain. She did not call herself anything. Not healer. Not witch. Not windwalker. She simply taught what she had learned from listening. The elders tried again. They called her mother. Told her to stop Ebony before it was too late. But her mother, who once wept from the memory of her own childhood dreams, only said, "She walks now. Let her." They summoned her father, and he spat on the ground and refused to speak of her at all. Then one night, when the moon was a silver eyelid barely open, something strange occurred. Feathers began to appear, hundreds of them. Not falling from trees. Not drifting from birds. But arranged. Deliberate. Ebony awoke before dawn, the wind gently pulling at her mat. She stepped outside and saw them, lined one by one in a narrow path, pale and glowing in the moonlight, leading away from her hut into the hills beyond the yam fields. She did not question. She walked. The feathers made no sound under her feet. The air was hushed, reverent. Each step felt familiar, though she had never walked this way before. As she climbed higher, the wind thickened, not like a storm but like a presence. Something vast. Something old. When she reached the top of the ridge, the world opened. The village lay far below, sleeping and unaware. The sky stretched wide, stars scattered like embers. And then she heard it, not in her ears but in her bones. The wind spoke. It was not words. It was movement, vibration, memory. It was every gust that had ever passed through her hair as a child, every breeze that had kissed her cheeks in secret, every scream she had once swallowed. And it welcomed her. She did not speak. She simply stood. A swirl of air gathered around her, lifting her shawl, tossing her braids, and then slowly lifting her, not high, not far, just enough for her heels to leave the earth. Just enough for her heart to remember. In that moment, Ebony knew, this path was not for her alone. This was for the child who wanted to run without shame. For the girl who feared her own shadow. For the boy who dreamed of soaring and was told not to cry. For her mother who once twirled under moonlight. For Kofi who now lived because she dared to sing. And for herself. When she returned to the village at dawn, feathers clung to her sleeves and her eyes held the storm. The children were waiting. She said nothing. But the wind carried her silence, and it was louder than any word. On the morning of her disappearance, the village woke to birds. They came before the sun had risen, their wings cutting the early mist, their cries echoing across the hills like distant drums. Dozens, maybe hundreds, hawks, doves, kites, spiraling in wide, patient circles over the ridge. At first no one noticed. Then one by one doors opened. Eyes lifted. And they saw it. No one had ever seen so many birds fly without a sound. Ebony was gone. Her hut sat quiet, undisturbed, the mat still warm from her absence. The children came first, barefoot and confused, calling her name. Then the mothers, murmuring prayers under their breath. By midday the whispers began. She's vanished again? She's gone to the spirits. No, she's called the birds. She's flown. No one knew what to believe. The elders tightened their robes and closed their doors, speaking to each other in guarded tones. Her father stood by the stream, watching the sky with clenched fists. Her mother sat in silence, weaving a basket with threads too fragile for the task. The birds did not leave. Each morning they returned, always circling, always silent, as though watching, as though waiting. By the third day, the village no longer asked aloud where Ebony had gone, because on the third evening she returned. She came barefoot from the hills, her skin dusted with pollen, her hair tangled with feathers not her own. Her steps were slow, not from weariness but from something deeper, like someone learning to walk again in a world they had forgotten. She looked not at the ground but at the sky, and when she entered the village, the air seemed to hush around her. Her eyes held more than color. They held sky and storm. The children ran to her but stopped just short as if afraid they might vanish into the wind she carried. Ebony smiled. That night, as the village sat tense in shadows, she spoke. Not loudly. Not to everyone. But to those who had waited. I have met the spirits, she said, her voice like a thread of wind through tall grass. Not in dreams. Not in madness. But in flight. The children leaned closer. Even the wind paused to listen. They are not gods, she continued. They are not devils. They are motion itself. The guardians of all things that move. The breath between footsteps. The whisper in a leap. They are what carries us forward when fear says stay. She told them of her journey beyond the ridge, to a place where time walked backward and trees bent not with wind, but with memory. She spoke of a clearing where air shimmered like water, and how she was lifted, not by wings but by trust. There, she said, she danced in silence with forms that had no faces but every shape. They moved like music, and they taught her. They showed me how to fall without fear, she said. How to listen with skin. How to rise not with force but surrender. The children asked what they looked like. They looked like the wind looks in your dreams, she replied. Word spread. By morning half the village knew. By afternoon the elders summoned her. She went, calm as ever, the wind trailing her shawl like a tail of smoke. Inside the council hut, the air was thick with heat and disapproval. The eldest elder, voice trembling with the weight of his years, spoke first. You must stop. Stop what? Ebony asked, though she already knew. These stories, he said. These winds you call spirits. You stir things that should sleep. Another elder added, the children climb trees now, Ebony. They jump from rocks. They whisper to leaves. They speak of flying. A third stood. You make them believe in what cannot be seen. Ebony listened. She did not interrupt. She waited. Then, when the silence thickened, she said only, what cannot be seen is what we breathe every moment. That answer did not soothe them. They warned her again. She must stop. For the safety of the children. For the unity of the village. For the order of things. But Ebony did not stop. That night, a girl named Lila climbed the tallest tamarind tree with no fear. When the wind gusted, she laughed and let go of one hand, watching her scarf catch the breeze. A boy named Tunji placed feathers in a circle near his sleeping mat, hoping for dreams of the sky. Another child whispered to a butterfly, asking it what secrets it carried. The village was no longer silent. Drums sounded in the evening, not from ritual but from children inventing rhythms with sticks and stones. Footprints appeared in places untouched for seasons. The sacred stream held floating petals and spirals, signs of a new kind of play. And the wind, oh the wind, it began to dance through the village like a restless spirit, teasing the flames of cooking fires, tugging at braids, spinning the woven hats from elders' heads. Some laughed. Others frowned. But no one could ignore it. One morning a child climbed onto Ebony's lap and asked, if the wind can walk, can it speak? Ebony paused. It speaks through you, she said, when you listen before you move. Soon, children were seen sitting quietly with eyes closed, heads tilted to the breeze. They whispered phrases not in any known language. They ran through fields not chasing but following. They moved like air given form, soft, quick, unpredictable. And then the drawings began. Charcoal lines on the sides of huts. Spiral shapes in the dust. Curved wings. Moving lines. Maps of air. Parents tried to scrub them, but they returned each dawn, redrawn by tiny fingers. It was not rebellion. It was wonder. The elders tried one last time. They called a meeting beneath the village baobab. Everyone was to come. Even Ebony. She arrived quietly with a trail of children behind her. Not because she asked but because they came. An elder stood. "We must decide," he said, "whether stories will rule us or sense. Whether wind and nonsense will raise our children or we will." Murmurs followed. Another rose. "This is not a trial of a girl," he said. "It is a trial of a village. What do we believe?" They turned to Ebony. And she spoke. "Belief," she said, "is not what we tell ourselves. It is what we follow when we are alone." The breeze stirred. "I have never asked you to follow me," she said. "Only to listen, to the same wind you walk through daily. It is not mine. It is yours." She looked to the sky where a single bird circled. "I do not want worship. I want movement. I want the children to know they are not rooted like stones but shaped like rivers. That they can bend and rise and drift without shame." She paused. "If that is danger to you, then perhaps it is time we all became dangerous." No one spoke. Not even the elders. That night, children danced. Not wildly. Not loudly. Just enough to stir the dust. Just enough to keep the wind company. And for the first time in many seasons, laughter echoed not from fear or mockery, but from freedom. The village, once quiet, now hummed. The wind had found a voice. And it was many voices, young, curious, fearless. The wind festival began before the sun knew it was morning. Children tied feathers to their wrists, their ankles, their hair. Women painted their faces with swirls that mimicked breeze paths. Men drummed not to summon spirits but to honor them, each beat syncing with the gentle pulsing of the earth. Kijiji pulsed with motion, cloth fluttered, songs danced on air, and dust spun in celebratory spirals as though even the ground wished to take flight. And Ebony stood in the middle of it all, still. She wore a wrap the color of sky at dawn, soft blue threaded with silver that caught the light. Around her neck hung a small pouch of wind herbs, gifted by a child who said, "To help you fly farther." Her eyes, brighter than fire, watched the village move like leaves in rhythm, but her gaze kept drifting to the tall irako tree at the edge of the hill. It was the tallest tree in the land. For as long as stories remembered, it had been forbidden to climb it during the wind festival. The elders feared that the winds, stronger on that day than any other, might carry someone off, never to be seen again. But Ebony was not like anyone else. Whispers moved faster than the breeze. "She's going to do it." No, she wouldn't. Not today. Did you see the look in her eyes? Her mother knew. She always knew. She found Ebony just as the drums began their second rhythm. Faster, deeper. "Don't do this," her mother begged, gripping her daughter's wrist. "Please. If you love me, stay." Ebony turned. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a fire that was no longer earthbound. "I do love you," she said. "But I must go where I am called." Her mother shook her head. "You are still a girl." Ebony smiled. "Then let me grow wings before your eyes." The crowd began to gather at the base of the irako tree. Children sat cross-legged in the grass. Elders murmured to one another, alarm rising in their voices. Her father stood at the edge, fists clenched, jaw tight, saying nothing. Ebony stepped forward. The first branch was far above the ground. She ran and leapt, not wildly but with a grace that seemed not borrowed but earned. Her fingers grasped bark as though it welcomed her, and she climbed, not hurried, not hesitant, but like one returning home. Each branch she touched hummed beneath her skin. Each step upward made the wind stir louder. Halfway up, the tree began to sway. A gasp rippled through the crowd. "She will fall." "No," a child whispered. "She's dancing." And it did look like a dance. Her limbs moved like poetry, her body rising with the wind, not against it. Airlifting. Fingers spreading. She paused only once, when a hawk landed just above her, staring with eyes that held no fear. Then it launched and she followed. When she reached the highest branch, the tree bent ever so slightly, not from weight but reverence. She stood. Below, her mother fell to her knees. "Come down," her voice cracked, barely heard. But the wind had other plans. It came not as a gust but as a gathering. From every direction, it met her, not to fight but to hold. It curled around her arms, lifted the hem of her wrap, swirled around her legs like vines of air. A sound filled the space, not thunder, not song, but something between, a breath shared by every spirit watching. Then, without a cry, without warning, feathers burst from her back. Not 2, not 10, but hundreds, fine and golden, laced with silver edges that shimmered in the sunlight. They grew where once her scars lived, where pain had taken root. Now there was only beauty, only sky. The crowd gasped. Some cried out. Ebony looked down, not in fear but joy. And then she jumped. But she did not fall. For one heart-stopping moment she hung midair, arms out, hair wild, feathers unfurling like wings in bloom. Then slowly she began to rise. Higher, lighter, brighter. Laughter, rich and full and untouched by earth, echoed from her lips. It wasn't human laughter, nor was it divine. It was the sound of freedom remembering itself. She soared once around the tree, then looped above the village, feathers scattering in her wake. Each one that fell turned to dust before reaching the ground, but the warmth they left lingered in the skin of those who watched. People dropped to their knees. Mothers wept. Fathers bowed their heads, tears running down cheeks and used to softness. The elders, once firm in their disapproval, now stared skyward with mouths parted, words lost to wind. Ebony flew over the river, casting ripples that glowed briefly, then calmed. She spun above the baobab where judgments had been passed, where fear had once planted roots. And there she hovered, arms out, wind curling around her, lifting her ever so slightly higher. The sky opened above her, wide, endless, welcoming. She looked down once more. The village was not the same. Something had shifted, not just in what was seen but in what was now believed. No longer was she the cursed child, the silent girl, the one burdened with unseen grief. She had become more than a story. She had become a truth. And truths could fly. When she finally descended, it was not with exhaustion but ease, as if gravity now bargained with her rather than commanded. She landed barefoot in the center of the village square, wings folding gently against her back, disappearing slowly into her skin as if never there. Only the light in her eyes remained. And the silence that followed was not fear, but reverence. Then a child approached, a small boy no older than 6. He held a single white feather, cupped like a treasure in his palms. "Did you drop this?" he asked. Ebony bent to meet his eyes. "No," she said. "That's yours now." He looked confused. "But I don't have wings." Ebony smiled. "Not yet." And with that the drums resumed, not wild, not forced but steady. Like heartbeats, like footsteps toward something new. The wind danced between huts. Mothers stood straighter. Fathers wept openly. Children climbed trees without asking. And the elders, once protectors of silence, found themselves listening, not speaking. Kijiji would never be the same. Not because Ebony flew, but because in doing so she taught them all they could rise. They say she never landed. That when Ebony descended from the skies, her feet only kissed the earth for a moment. A whisper, a promise, a breath, and then she rose again carried by a wind that now bore her name. In the seasons that followed, the village of Kijiji changed in ways the ancestors had not foreseen. Girls who once walked with eyes lowered began tilting their heads upward. The sky was no longer a distant dome of blue, it was a path, a calling, a story waiting to be entered. And each time the wind stirred the trees, the villagers paused to listen, just in case it was Ebony speaking. The Irako tree, once a sacred pillar wrapped in rules and fear, became a sanctuary. Girls came at dawn, barefoot and blinking sleep from their eyes, feathers clenched in their hands. Some plucked them from the wings of birds, others wove them from grasses and hope. They placed them at the roots of the tree in silence, sometimes with a whispered plea, "Let me be bold, let me fly, let me not be small." The feathers never stayed. By morning they were gone. Not scattered, not stolen, simply vanished. And each girl would rise from the earth with her eyes a little wider, her steps a little lighter, the wind brushing against her skin like a cloak that remembered her name. The elders, once fierce in their judgments, now sat beneath the tree they once forbade. Wrinkled hands trembled as they pressed palms into the bark, whispering wishes too long buried. One asked to see his dead daughter in a dream. Another asked to be forgiven by the wind for silencing his wife. And one, silent since the day Ebony soared, cried openly and said, "I wanted to fly too. I just never knew how." They renamed the Wind Festival. No longer was it a celebration of old stories or prescribed rituals. It became the Yupopo wa Ebony, Ebony's wind. Girls led the ceremonies now, draped in feathers and dreams. Boys followed them, not as rulers but as witnesses. Songs were sung that had never been written, only felt, melodies that rose and fell with the wind, carried to the corners of the valley where old grief had once hidden. No girl was ever confined again. The last mother to reach for her daughter's wrist, saying you must stay, stopped mid-sentence when a sudden gust of wind scattered ashes across the compound, ashes that no fire had made. She took her hands back and said only, fly if you must. But fly knowing we love you. The transformation of Kijiji was not loud, not sudden. It came like the changing of a season, quiet, inevitable and everywhere. Abony's hut, once a place of suspicion and silence, became a place of flight. Children left drawings made of crushed berries on its walls, stick figures with wings, storms smiling, trees dancing. Women brought food not out of charity but reverence. Wind herbs hung from the doorways and inside the air always smelled like early rain, clean, electric, expectant. Some swore that feathers still lay curled on her sleeping mat. Others said they heard flapping from the rafters at night, though no bird had been seen entering. The mat remained untouched as if waiting. And outside the hut, in the soft earth, a single footprint remained, delicate, almost bird-like but unmistakably human. When storms came they no longer inspired fear. Thunder was met with laughter. Lightning was called Abony's dance. Mothers held their children up to open doorways, letting the wind kiss their cheeks. When the sky split open and rain came sideways they said, she's here. She's watching. And some even ran into the storm, arms wide, begging the whirlwind to lift them. One girl, Nia, daughter of the village potter, stood in the rain so long that when it stopped, her skin shimmered like polished clay, and her hair stood upright for days. She told everyone that the storm had whispered her name. She began climbing trees without fear and said she saw faces in clouds. Nobody laughed. Instead they watched her closely, protectively, because in Kijiji girls who heard the wind were precious. In time children were named after her. Not just Abony, but wind, feather, storm, sky. A boy named Twiga was said to have been born during a wind so strong it tore the roof off the birthing hut, but left the mother and child untouched. He would later grow taller than anyone in the village and was known to walk without making a sound. Even the animals changed. Birds nested lower, closer to the village. Owls blinked during daylight and did not flee from human footsteps. Goats stood still when wind brushed past them as though listening. And dogs howled in rhythm with the storm, not against it. One day an old man, blind from age, bent from regret, came to the base of the Irako tree. He sat without speaking, only breathing, his hands resting on the bark. And the wind picked up. It circled him once, then again, then lifted the edge of his tattered robe. His eyes, though milky and worn, filled with tears. She forgives me, he said aloud. Nobody had spoken. Nobody needed to. The village scribe, a quiet woman named Okani, began carving Abony's story into stone. She placed the tablets along the path to the tree, one for each stage, her silence, her climb, her flight. When she reached the part where Abony soared, she stopped. The wind won't let me carve it, she said. It keeps blowing the dust back into the stone. So she left it blank. And in time that empty tablet became the most sacred of all. People stood before it for hours, staring not at what was there but what wasn't, each imagining their own version of the flight, each holding their breath. And Abony? She was everywhere. In the way the market leaves rustled without footsteps. In the way the morning mist sometimes danced before lifting. In the hush just before a thunderclap. Sometimes a gust would lift a bowl off a ledge or spin a child's toy in a direction no one had touched. A piece of cloth would vanish from a clothesline, only to be found later twisted around the base of the Irako tree. The villagers stopped calling these things strange. They called them visits. She's watching. She's playing. She's reminding us. And still, no one saw her. Not fully. Not clearly. But they felt her. One child claimed to have seen her in a dream, riding a hawk across a sky made of mirrors. Another said she danced on clouds and braided wind into ropes. A boy named Kola said she had wings made of fire now, and when she laughed, rain turned into feathers. No adult corrected them. Who were they to say what Abony could or could not become? The world no longer bowed to logic. It bent toward wonder. And in this new village, where the wind had memory and wings, people began to live differently. Girls spoke with certainty even when they were small. Boys learned to listen. Mothers told stories where daughters did not wait to be rescued. Fathers wept when the wind reminded them of mistakes, but found forgiveness in the way the breeze curled around their ears. And in every storm, in every whirlwind that dared touch the earth, there was a whisper. Not loud, not boastful, but undeniable. Ebony. She was legend. She was wind. She was every girl who refused to be broken. And in Kijiji she flew still, not in form but in freedom. Not in body, but in the way the world tilted upward when people dared to rise.